Hello, and welcome to the latest podcast edition from the Culture, Society and Security team at ITSS Verona. My name is Lee Dawson, and I'm joined by my colleagues Julia Hodgins and Sofia Stadarini. And today we have the pleasure of interviewing Dr Maxim Alyukov about his critical insights into the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Dr Alyukov is a postdoctoral fellow at the Russia Institute in King's College London. He's also a researcher with the Public Sociology Laboratory at the Centre for Independent Social Research, St. Petersburg. Maxim's research has been published in a variety of disciplinary and area studies in journals such as Politics, Qualitative Psychology, and Europe-Asia Studies. Maxim holds a PhD in Social Sciences from the University of Helsinki and an MA in Sociology from the European University at St. Petersburg. During our interview, we'll explore the core and very timely findings in his recent PhD dissertation titled Making Sense of the News in an Authoritarian Regime, Russian Television Viewers' Reception of the Russia-Ukraine Conflict. In this study, Maxim applies the conceptual apparatuses of cognitive and political psychology to understand media news reception under Russia's authoritarian regime. The dissertation explored how political engagement affects the ways Russian citizens interpret the news about the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict and evaluate the credibility of the regime's propaganda. In addition, it focuses on how citizens interpret political information in a hybrid media system in which the regime attempts to spread similar narratives simultaneously across different types of media, including television, news aggregators, online news media, and social media. So thank you for joining us, Maxim.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Thanks.
No worries. Now, there's a lot to unpack in your study, but I'd like to firstly ask about the overall perceptions of the media by both autocrats and people who live in an autocracy. So what are some of the strategies autocrats use to manipulate media for their own personal satisfaction? And what is the typical response in communities towards this propaganda? And are online news services from the West threatening government messages to its people?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's a very broad question and it's very difficult to answer it in a short way because it's like 50 years of research on this issue. Autocrats, of course, they perceive the media as a threat and try to repress them and instrumentalize them. So it happens in literally any autocracy like Turkey, Russia, China, anywhere. And but they also face some challenges too. So it's impossible to micromanage all journalists and on state television and all these media organizations. So they often stick to controlling, commanding heads, such as major national television networks, and repressing some prominent media outlets. Free media can also be useful for some autocrats. For instance, there is research showing that poor autocrats are more likely to keep some free media because they report on policy failures, and that's actually useful for autocrats. And richer autocrats like Russia, they are less likely to do so because the benefits of free media are just lower for them rather than the cost, because media can trigger public discontent. So speaking about strategies, it's just a very broad question. There are so many of them. So first of all, propaganda attempts to persuade people, obviously, and to increase regime support, although this function has been challenged in the past 30, 40 years, because we know that people tend to filter media and political information through their existing political preferences. However, it can still have an effect, especially if people are fed propaganda for years, like it happened in Russia. There are other functions. So regime propaganda also performs signaling function, right? So even if people don't really believe, don't really buy propaganda, it demonstrates that the regime is so powerful that there's so much resources into propaganda. So it's basically saying, don't mess with me, even if you don't believe me. Yeah, it can also instill political apathy and cynicism. So for instance, there is research showing that in countries such as China and Russia, people are not really persuaded by propaganda, but propaganda demonstrates them that any kind of media, any kind of politics is biased and dirty. So don't mess with politics at all, these messages are saying. Yeah, but the responses of the audience can be very different. So we know that especially in authoritarian states, which have this legacy of propaganda and totalitarianism and authoritarianism, people take propaganda with a grain of salt. So they know that media are manipulative. On the other hand, it really depends on particular audiences. So for some people, it taps in their pre-existing political preferences and attitudes, right? So for instance, in Russia, research shows that the regime has been very successful at instrumentalizing this political and economic crisis of the 90s, saying that Putin is a person who led the country out of it. So it basically taps into some pre-existing attitudes. But it may work for some people, it doesn't really work for other people. And it's a very broad question. There's many strategies and many different responses from people. I don't know how to answer it in a short way.
Thank you very much for that answer, Maxime. Recalling Dr. Sam Green's statement that the largest explanatory factor of the support held for Putin after the Crimea annexation, he found to be agreeableness. Focus group are tools that help us uncover drivers and motivations. While not projectable, they enrich with texture, color, and depth the understanding of a topic. However, as any tools, it has risk, and agreeableness, deflection, complementary projection, or others could influence the group discussion. What challenges did you face while designing the study and conducting the focus group with participants that live in an opinion-controlled environment, presumably driven by fear and survival responses? What resources did you use to mitigate with those? If you would like to share with us, please.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's true. Obviously, focus groups are basically group discussions. So especially in authoritarian context, some people might be influenced by fear or by what other people say. But there are several caveats here. So first of all, I just want to make a disclaimer. This study is based on the data which I collected back in 2016 and 17. So it's not really about this phase of the war, although it's still relevant because key narratives and key messages sent by the regime are still the same. And back then, the opinion climate was not that tense as today, because today we have evidence showing that many people just refuse to participate in any kind of research because they're afraid. But there are specific techniques designed by social scientists to kind of counter this preference falsification. So in 2015, for instance, scholars showed that the magnitude of preference falsification was not that high. So people were not actually lying about what they feel and what they think about Putin and the regime, because the context was not, it was repressive, but not that repressive. So anti-war demonstrations were possible, for instance. Back then they were legal, unlike now. And second, it's really important fundamental question, because it depends on how you see the nature of public opinion. So some people see public opinions basically aggregate some of individual opinions of people. And if you see it in this way, then group dynamics is something which distorts these individual opinions. But at the same time, there is overwhelming evidence in psychology showing that our opinions are not really individual opinions, right? So we form and formulate our opinions based on what we hear from others. We rely on others as sources of information, as cues which tell us how to think about specific issues. So Sam's point is not that agreeableness is something which distorts the results. He basically shows that it's a fundamental part of authoritarian societies. So people are very much influenced by what they see as prevailing consensus in society, and they form their own opinions based on how they think other people think in society. And actually in focus groups help you to show and to observe the dynamics. So of course, sometimes you see that some participants kind of show forced responses, agreeing with someone or something they not really agree with. So, but the opposite was also true. So sometimes imagine the following scenario: a person is being critical of the regime, but he or she feels that the prevailing consensus is against her opinion. And when somebody else in this focus group room shares a critical reaction. So for this first person, it's just a confirmation it's okay to be critical. So, and you can see like chain reaction when critical responses of some people actually help other people to express critical opinions. Or it's also very important to remember that most people who participated in my research and most people who actually watch television and consume political information in all countries, they are not that, political activists who have formulated opinions from the very beginning. Sometimes you see a social situation when a person has some unarticulated criticism, but she's not really, cannot really articulate it right now without without hearing some other opinions. So, and focus group basically demonstrate the social dynamics. Of course, there are some weaknesses, but there are also strengths, and it's just important to keep them in mind while conducting them. So it's not something which kind of does not allow you to explore the public opinion dynamics at all.
Thank you, Maxim. My question revolves about the latter geopolitical events. So I'm sorry if it's not mainly addressed to your studies, but I think it could be very interesting to have your insight about it. So in Western media, the perception that was given was first that the Russian population supported the armed invasion, was against the war in Ukraine. While now recent polls state that 86.6% of Russians support the armed invasion in other European countries. So how has the news landscape shaped the Russian population perception of the recent war? And what instruments were more used, accessibility or applicability effects?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So first of all, I want to point it out, it's very important to be careful with polls right now, because polls are also a political weapon. Again, based on what the research by Sam Green you mentioned, based on my research, you see that people are it's very important of them to know how people around them think about politics. And therefore, these numbers, which are widely circulated in the media, they also a part of this, can be a part of manipulative information. And the particular poll you cite is extremely manipulative poll, which is basically a piece of disinformation. So it's an example of push poll, or a poll which is based on manipulative questions to get desired answers. And I just know I saw it before. So, and the results in this poll are higher than those, the Russian state pollsters provide, which are beyond manipulative. Let me just, demonstrate you a couple of examples from this poll. So the question, the first question in this poll: what countries do you think are responsible for supporting Nazism in Ukraine? Right. So this question is very manipulative because it assumes by default that there is Nazism in Ukraine, and it is by default, and it does not really give any options to respondents, to participants who do not agree with this idea that there's Nazism in Ukraine. The particular result which you cited, 87% of Russians support the armed invasion of Ukraine. So first of all, the question itself was manipulative. So do you think should the Russian Federation militarily force other countries to abandon their support for Nazism in Ukraine? Again, Nazism in Ukraine is assumed by default. And second, they also had only 3 options, right? So they didn't have I don't know option. They had yes option, no option, and maybe option, maybe not, maybe yes. And what they did, they actually lumped together 2 different types of responses. So there were 40% of people who said yes, right? But there were around 40-something% of people who said maybe yes, maybe no. And maybe yes, maybe no, it's a way of people to say, I have no idea. It's not a way to say yes. But in the report, these people who did this poll, they lumped these categories together, saying that 87% or something support the invasion. And the poll itself was conducted via Viber. So Viber is used by only 1/4 of Russian population, so it's not really representative. And predominantly it's used by the older people who are more likely to support the regime. So there are all kinds of tricks in this specific poll. There are some tricks in other polls. So it's very important to be careful here. It's not like this. So the 87% of Russian citizens do not really support the idea that Russia should invade other countries. Yeah, speaking about the mechanisms. So first of all, yeah, so these are not really instruments. So accessibility and applicability are basic fundamental psychological mechanisms. So these are just concepts which describe how memory works. So applicability refers to kind of more coherent narratives, or psychologists call them schemas, which are in people's memory. So like think about typical anti-Western political attitudes, right? So a person has a bunch of ideas in her and his head. So support for Putin, criticism of NATO, specific ideas about specific events, like negative attitudes towards, NATO's bombing of Belgrade and many other things, anti-LGBT ideas and xenophobic ideas. And these ideas are kind of bundled together in a coherent whole. And basically, regime propaganda triggers the schemas in memory and forces people to apply them to the events they see. So I think this mechanism is more about how memory works in some areas where people have some understanding of the issue, however superficial and stereotypical. So these people paid some attention to actually thinking about this issue. Yeah, so in my research, I showed that it's more relevant for people who are kind of politically engaged, both pro-Putin and anti-Putin. And accessibility refers to a situation when people have less experience and less understanding what they're dealing with. So basically, we hastily draw on some most prominent memories which we have in our mind in order to make sense of the situation. When you hear on the television that NATO is evil every day, and then a survey question contains the word NATO, you kind of automatically resonates with available memories, and you are likely to answer that NATO is an enemy, right? So although you don't fully understand what this word means and and how politics works, so you're kind of unsure about your own opinion. So it describes how political cognition of the majority of less kind of engaged media users work. So Russian news landscape, of course, triggers these effects, right? But again, any information landscape does, because these are basic effects. So the key here is not these mechanisms, but the content of this information. So what specific narratives are triggered. And of course, today, less engaged accessibility effect, you can really observe it and see how it works, because less engaged people are reminded by state narratives, which they about the kind of Kremlin's vision of the events. And they use these narratives as frameworks for interpreting political events they see. Yeah, so more engaged people can rely on their pre-existing attitudes, and television in this case acts in a different way. So it basically reinforces coherent schemas and opinions they already have. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I think it was really interesting to debunking the report.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I mean, you can, many people prefer to blame like Russian citizens today. Okay, fine, right? But don't use disinformation, because it undermines the credibility of any claim.
Thank you for that, Maxim. Our next question is, the Russian population has had its information challenges controlled since the Soviet era, and remaining as such makes them more vulnerable to disinformation that happens in democracies, as well as you were mentioning, as we have recently seen in USA, Canada, and back in the United Kingdom with the Brexit referendum. Russian state-owned television has somewhat influenced viewers into finding ways to escape the elaboration of opinion via confirmation bias or availability of information. We can speculate if that responds to fear of consequences of disagreeing. In an eventual regime transition, optimistically towards a participative democracy, what strategies would you recommend to build the analytical capacities of the population back?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's a very difficult question, right? But yeah, so how I see it, basically, when people engage analytically with certain political issues, their level of engagement is basically a function of how political environment is structured, right? So if they won't elaborate any opinions if they feel and they feel like this right now, that they have no stakes in this game, right? So nothing depends on them. And the answer to this question about analytic capacities is actually political in nature. So as cognitive psychologists show, people deploy mental resources strategically. So when they feel, depending on the perceived importance of the problem, on tractability of the problem, if they feel that engagement is useless, why bother acquiring political information and thinking about it? So the answer to this question is it's really, there's nothing kind of new and unusual here. First of all, you need competitive political system, like parties, politicians should actually matter, because in Russia, the regime has actually been playing successfully on the feeling of apathy and powerlessness. So as my colleagues here, I think, show, for instance, this rallying of public opinion around the annexation of Crimea was partially a result of, because many people saw it as a sign that Russia and Russian citizens finally matter. And this was partially a result of the chaotic 90s of political and economic chaos. And Putin basically gave them this image that they matter. And in the context of previous kind of feeling of apathy and political powerlessness, it worked. It resonated with them because there was this feeling of apathy. So, of course, competitive media system is also very important, right? So people should feel that they can find credible information, even if it's difficult. So today, some people believe propaganda, but many don't. But at the same time, they think that they cannot believe any type of information at all. And this kind of cynicism and political apathy is also problematic. But when you have some diversity of opinions in the media sphere, it still kind of creates the impression that you can at least try to figure out what's going on. And yeah, so the problem here is like a chicken or egg problem. In order to build more democratic society, you need competitive media and political system. But in order to have competitive media and political system, you need more democratic society. Yeah.
Yeah, almost a segue from what you were just saying there, Maxim. But one of the strongest elements of your study that resonated with me was that political identification was one of the strongest predictors of trust. Mm-hmm. So many viewers would tune in to hear and respond positively to Russian news that saw the West as an adversary and a threat to Russian sovereignty. But at the same time, your study also looked at the way images of images of Russian attacks in Ukraine, Crimea, and what have you, turned those same very people away from the news, government ideology, and so on, and actually fostered resistance to those ongoing conflicts. So to what extent do you believe that the media has shifted views in Russia, both for or against the present conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's a very important question. It's very hard to say now because we don't really have any data on how people respond to this newest phase of the war. Polling data we have currently is not really reliable because of many issues. So like, for instance, in the recent surveys, response rate was close to 5%. So actually 1 in 20 respondents agreed to participate in the survey. And people stop answering questions when the interviewer actually reaches political questions about Ukraine. So we can assume that many people just feel afraid, scared, and they think that these questions will be just sent to the Federal Security Services. And that's why they decide not to participate in service. And of course, pollsters do not actually focus on media consumption, so we don't know. From what I see, based on anecdotal evidence and my personal experience, there was an enormous increase in news consumption in the first few days of the conflict. And that just happens all the time, right? So when coronavirus hits, people watch the news every day. When some war happens, people watch the news every day. But then it strongly decreased. And I don't know how much and to what extent, but from what I see, that many people decide to stop watching the news to avoid traumatic experience altogether. And surprisingly, I observe such reactions even among kind of core Putin supporters. So people who believe propaganda, who support Putin, but they feel that something terrible is happening. And it's very difficult for them to kind of, reconcile these ideas. And they opt for kind of tuning out completely of the news in order to avoid these difficult feelings. So, but of course, these are just some people, not all people, and some have been watching television intensively. Hard to say without data, but obviously based on this, I know that this coverage and this focus on war and suffering, and brings a lot of negative feelings. And even for people who are kind of politically engaged after Putin, it generates some cognitive dissonance, I think. So I would say that now, yeah, probably even less people watch television less, definitely less than in the beginning of the conflict, maybe less than prior to the conflict.
Thank you very much. And one final question. So now I'm quoting your research. Citizens under authoritarian regime are politically disengaged. Without interest in politics, they cannot meaningfully engage with political information and hastily draw up on top of the head ideas in interpreting the news. So to what extent the recent geopolitical events may have affected the Russian population and possibly have pushed them to be more aware of both the international and external influence of the political decision of their country? There has been a lot of effort in the Western Hemisphere to appeal directly to the Russian population as this Schwarzenegger message to the Russian people. So how may the internet landscape have influenced this awareness?
Yeah, again, hard to say without evidence at hand. So, but what I know and what we've seen clearly, like generally in research and based on research which is done in the past years, is that geopolitical events are not enough to generate sustained interest. So you've got a spike of attention and increased interest in the news in some days, weeks, maybe months, but that's just not enough to make people politically engaged. Even the annexation of Crimea, which was welcomed by many Russians and was surrounded by this, positive emotions, it did not generate the sustained interest in politics in the long term. So, and negative news like this, they produce short-term spikes in attention to politics, but it's not the same as learning about politics on day-to-day basis. So for these people need to feel that they have stakes in the political process and there is some easily available and diverse information. So, and I don't think that it will produce some kind of long-term interest or something like this. And I don't think that the internet does not, I think that internet does not change the situation much, quite the opposite. We know from, classics of political communication research is that when people have more media choice, they tend to tune out, right? So it's paradoxical. But when people had access to television only, it's in 1970s, they sort of learned about politics whether they wanted or not, because there was no way around the news, right? So today they have a chance to escape information, and many people do. So the role of personal kind of preferences and motivation increased dramatically. And since not all of them are news junkies, it actually increases knowledge gap between those who learn something about politics and those who don't. And yeah, so if we kind of talking about Russia and internet and this specific conflict, I would say that it's very confusing for many people. So right now, if you don't want to watch television, you don't want to consume regime propaganda, you will go online, right? So you use Telegram, social media, and so on. But there are many competing narratives, right? So even if people replace television with the internet, it's difficult to figure out whom to trust on Telegram, because there is massive presence of regime-oriented channels, regime control channels, and channels of regime supporters on social media. And yeah, Russian citizens have access to all kinds of independent information on social media, but there are pro-regime channels as well. And probably that's what the reason they decided not to block Telegram, but block Facebook, Twitter, and other social media. So you cannot really use reputation of the media as a heuristic in an authoritarian context. And the burden of verifying credibility of this information falls on you. And not many people are ready for this, both democracies and autocracies, when you have to constantly verify what you are seeing. Because somewhere in the United States, you can just trust your favorite media outlet, like New York Times, that's fine. And here you have to actually check information. And yeah, so I think because of this confusing flow of contradictory narratives, maybe many people just tune out because they are confused, they cannot figure out what's going on. So yeah, I would say that internet, of course, presents some challenges to authoritarian narratives, but that's not a panacea, right? So.
Well, Maxim, it has been a fascinating discussion, certainly. Thank you very much for that. It is also true that the dangers of autocratic control of information and opinion are as perilous as disinformation campaigns inflicted in democratic environments, because we're not free of those either, whereby grim consequences sadly damage the social fabric for the long term, as anti-democratic attacks in January 6, 2021 in USA and in February 2022 in Canada has shown us so far. We hope this discussion contributes to creating curiosity on the topic. Thank you very much to everybody for your attention, and we hope to have you, Maxim, back for more discussions of this sort. Please do not forget to follow us, ITSS, on social media, and to visit ITSSverona.it for access to our podcast, blog posts, and research topics.
Yeah, thank you very much for your fascinating questions. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Can we stop the recording, Lee?